Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hi, welcome to Economics. The coronavirus or the COVID pandemic, followed by the lockdown and the economic slowdown, which was already hurting the Indian economy, has produced one more crisis. And that has to do with GST or the Goods and Services Tax. You must have been seeing some of the headlines in recent days about how the central government and the states are fighting over the shortfall. Let me tell you, GST is a very complicated tax. And we have Professor Ila Patnaik here to simplify what this entire conflict is about. The states want the center to make up for the shortfall. The center says go and borrow the money. But what really is happening? This is a big center-state crisis that has already built up. And right now, it seems to be some kind of a stalemate. So, Ila, thanks for writing this column, which will be there in the description of this video today, and offering to simplify this to our viewers. Just tell us very briefly, what is the root of this conflict?
When the GST was introduced, many states were unwilling to accept the new GST because it meant that they were going to give up a lot of their taxes. GST replaced a number of taxes, octroi, this, that, and the other. Now, because of the requirement that this had to be a nationwide single national tax, you had to get the opt-in of all states. And at that time, what Mr. Jaitley actually offered the states, which they agreed to, because the center and the states had to agree to a nationwide GST, what was offered to the states was that they would be compensated for the loss that they might incur due to the implementation of the GST. This loss was to be compensated for by a cess. So that's why you must have been reading things about the compensation cess, that there would be, there is a cess when we are paying GST at the high rates, then we find that there is a cess on top of the GST. And this cess actually goes for this compensation that has to be paid to states. The center promised that this compensation would be at a rate of growth of 14%. That means if in the first year, in 14-15, you paid 100, then in 15-16, you would pay 100 plus 14. It was quite a high rate. The economy and taxation doesn't always go at 14, especially if inflation is low and inflation is about, say, 4%, which was the target. But an adequate compensation was promised so that the states agree. What's happened because of COVID is that actually you don't have that amount of cess at all. And so if the center was to say to states that we'll compensate you for your loss due to GST implementation at the rate at which we have promised, then the center would have to borrow. Mm-hmm. So the center, which is already in dire straits, where we've been talking about it not getting enough tax revenue, disinvestment proceeds are in trouble. It has already said that it would spend more, so it has to borrow more. So the center doesn't clearly want to take on this additional borrowing. Mm-hmm. And so the center is saying to states, why don't you borrow? Because you're in a better position to borrow. You haven't met your FRBM, you haven't hit your FRBM ceilings. They've come up with with two options that they've given to states and said that instead of us borrowing, you borrow. The two options differ in terms of who pays the interest and how much is the amount, and we can come to that.
So that's the technical part of the arrangement. But the more I don't know if it's right to call it the philosophical promise made that the center will take or shoulder the burden of compensating the states. The fight now is that you agreed to take away all our taxes and subsume it into one GST and promised to compensate us, and now you're not compensating us, or you're saying it's an act of God, as the finance minister said. It looks like a no-win situation for either side, isn't it, Ila?
So let's try and understand what is the argument that the center is making, and then the argument that the states are making. Now, if you look at the center's argument, the center says, I only promised to compensate you for the loss that you are incurring due to implementation of GST, not the total loss you incur if the economy slows down.
Yeah.
Okay? Clearly, there's a big difference between the two, because a lot of the loss that states are facing, indeed the center is also facing, is because the economy has slowed down. You've seen nearly a 24% contraction in the first quarter. So GDP has gone down, so tax revenue has gone down, collections have gone down. So this is the center's view, that even if we compensate you, it will be for the amount that you've lost due to GST implementation. And that is why, if you look at the two options that are being given, one of the options is that you can borrow less, a smaller amount, which is through an RBI window, and states are being asked to choose which one they want to vote for. And there, the interest that would be paid by the states will later be, or that interest would be paid out of the compensation cess. Initially, the cess was there only for a period of 5 years, but now it will have to be extended. That period will have to be extended, and the cess will continue longer. So that's the idea behind what the center is arguing. Now, of course, the states are arguing that we haven't faced a loss. We have committed expenditure. We haven't faced a loss merely on account of the implementation of GST. We have faced a loss on account of this entire COVID situation and the lockdown, and that we need to continue our expenditures. We need to pay out salaries, and therefore we need a bigger amount. And that's where the center steps in with the second option, which is, okay, go borrow a bigger amount, but then you pay interest on it. The interest doesn't get paid out of the cess. So it's really, at the end of the day, it is the amount and who pays the interest. That's where the problem is.
But there is this other argument, Ila, and I know this is a very, very technical issue we are trying to simplify. Who is in a better position to borrow? The states are saying the center is in a better position to borrow. The center is saying you have more room to borrow because of the FRBM ceiling. Can you simplify this? Who is in a better position to borrow business?
Okay, so normally, because the government of India borrows, there is some sort of a central government bond market. Whereas for the state governments, the bond market is very, very narrow, very thin. So there are a few participants who buy state government bonds. Generally, the yield does not even differ according to the health of the fisc of the state. So it's, we haven't built a government bond market in India. What we have is an arrangement between the Reserve Bank of India, which is both the banking regulator and the debt manager. And then it says, okay, this much of borrowing, they still call it market borrowing. And they say, okay, this much of market borrowing is to be done at this rate, and so will borrow. And there, in that sense, because we don't actually have a market, there is this artificial market in which the center and the RBI can actually offer to the states that, okay, you will all borrow at the same rate at which the center, where that's one of the things that is being discussed. That normally you would have found that the state pays a little higher than the center pays. But in this particular situation, they're being told that no, maybe you can borrow at the same rate at which the center is borrowing. Now, so that's about the interest rate. So normally the center is in a better position to borrow because it has a wider market. There are more people willing to hold central government bonds. The ability of the center to raise revenue and hence to be able to pay back its debt is normally higher than the states. So there's not much of a deep bond market for state government bonds. In the present situation, the center is arguing that states have room to borrow. Because they haven't borrowed so much, they have room to borrow. The center is already, raised its borrowing requirements thanks to the package that was given for COVID. And that's the argument that it is making. But, I think states have a point there that first you haven't really developed a bond market, which was the responsibility of the center, to set up a PDMA, to develop a bond market. And now you're stepping in and saying that state governments should borrow and bear the interest. So it's not just about the FRBM ceiling. So the center might say that the states have this, they have space in this FRBM ceiling and therefore they should be allowed to borrow. But it's not just about that. It is at the end of the day about who is going to pay the interest. And, the argument that the center seems to be making is that if the center borrows, then it could affect India's credit rating because the borrowing would become very large. So borrowing would be roughly about 3 lakh crore more than it is already planning to borrow. Here, let's just remember that actually nobody sees states' debt as something separate. When you look at the country's general debt, then it is the debt of the center plus the states. And in many ways, the center is actually implicitly guaranteeing the state debt as well. So as far as credit rating is concerned or any external observer is concerned, then there is not much of a difference between the central debt and the state debt. So in some ways, the center is better able to borrow, and also that then the center would pay the interest. And if it has made a commitment that this is what it is going to compensate the states, and if states want to go legal about it or they want to discuss it in parliament, or they want to go for discussing these two options rather than just accepting them, then there could be trouble.
So I will ask you two questions in one, Ila. If you were to decide who should borrow, what would your advice be? Should it be the states or should it be the center? Number one. And number two, if you are a state and then you had to exercise one of the two options, which is a better option for you?
So I think I would want the center to borrow, okay? Because I think the debt market is the center's responsibility. And once it has taken this decision of not really trying to develop a debt market, not have a debt manager, then the onus of when things go bad do fall upon the center. So I think it should be the center that should be addressing this issue. It is also from the point of view of how the economy gets affected. I think that has got to be our major consideration. If, because you are going to distinguish between borrowing by the states and borrowing by the center, rather than looking at the general total borrowing, if because of that, states start contracting expenditure at a time when the economy is already in contraction mode, then actually it makes things worse for the macroeconomy. You don't want states to start contracting expenditure. So, your total debt is going to be the same. But if because of who is going to pay the interest and whether the interest will come from the cess at the end of the 5-year period or not is going to affect how much states spend, then it would be better that the center borrows, transfers the money, let the money come from the cess later. Because it is already, our spending, our fiscal stimulus is constrained by the amount that we have. And, if you are going to borrow 100, then you want the maximum impact of the 100. You don't want that 100 has less impact than it could possibly have, just because you and I quibble about which one of us is going to pay the interest on it later.
And my second question about the two options.
Yeah, so I would do market borrowing because, you see, I don't just need to be compensated for the fall in GST because of the implementation issues. I would need to borrow. Usually states' budgets are quite tight. Okay, states have actually done much better than the center. Other than the DISCOM's problem, which has led states to have difficulties, they've actually done much better than the center on FRBM. You look back at the last few years. And at this time, I wouldn't want spending at the state level to be squeezed. So if I were a state, I would do market borrowing and hopefully, in the next few days, persuade the center that it pays interest. And if not, and if I have to pay interest, then also I would choose that option.
So you mean to say the second option of 2.35 lakh crores, that would be your choice?
Yeah, because of the loss in tax revenue that I'm facing because of COVID.
But as we have been reading reports, many states want to go for the first option. I think they want to remain cautious.
Absolutely. So more states have chosen the first option than the second option. I think it's because they don't want that extra burden of the interest payment that they would have to bear in the second option. I mean, it is a difficult decision, but with an economy that is contracting and where we don't want the total amount of borrowing to go up hugely, you also don't want the expenditure to be cut down. You don't want governments to start cutting expenditure at this stage. I mean, you can actually make the contraction much worse. I mean, here we are talking of a fiscal stimulus. And if instead of the stimulus, what we start actually doing is a cutting of expenditure, a fiscal contraction rather than a stimulus, then we could actually put the economy into even a worse situation. I mean, it's bad enough with a 24% decline. So it could get worse.
Last point, Ila, in your piece, you talk about the way out as a sustained borrowing trajectory. What is a sustained borrowing trajectory?
So my colleague Radhika Pandey and I have been working on this. And you see, what you want is debt not to become explosive. The total government debt should not grow at a rate which keeps increasing the debt to GDP ratio. And that really means that your interest rates should be low. The rate of growth of debt should be low. And in equilibrium, your debt GDP ratio should be constant and should not be explosive. So that's where you think about what is sustainable. And you borrow only as much as it allows you to keep your debt to GDP ratio constant. And here we think of the center plus states and not just, not merely the center. Okay. So it's a total debt that should be on a sustainable path.
Thank you so much, Ila. This was so much of a lesson for me as much as I hope it was for our viewers. GST and center state finances are such a complicated issue, and Ila is probably the best person placed to explain that for us. Thanks for watching this episode of Ilanomics. We will be back with another one next week. And I also want to thank our viewers and readers who have subscribed to The Print. And if you've not done so, please do take subscriptions. We need you to support and contribute and pay for good journalism. Thank you very much, and keep watching us.